so that often when there has been a major event, then the that they'll be sort of contacting us with their and playing a part in that news story. Shazzy asked earlier whether the internet would be a good source of finding information on reps, and I think we've got to be sort of careful about obviously the reliability of internet sources, but yes, it's obviously a very good research tool, and certainly in terms of finding out factual information about, for example, sort of which union represents which group of workers, it can be handy in that sense, as well as perhaps sort of explaining to us the About Us sections of various websites are usually pretty good at sort of telling us about that particular organisation. So that, for example, in recent years where there have been big mergers between unions, and there are some perhaps new unions that we weren't aware of a few years ago, like Unite is one of the biggest unions in the country now, but many people haven't actually heard of it. So in that sense, the internet, I think, is an invaluable source. Similarly, I mean, often you've got a sort of cross-pollination of information from one source. I mean, it's likely that when you're interviewing one person, they will also know who the main critics of the scheme are. So often one representative may be paving the way for you to find out who other representatives are who have different sort of views. Gilly just asked a technical question a little bit earlier about legality of recording an interview online or on the phone. I think it's not illegal to, I mean, it's obviously illegal to break into or in some way interrupt, bug somebody's line or anything. It's not illegal to sort of tape record them. I think as a custom and practice, though, for journalists is that our general sort of ethical guidance is that we normally identify ourselves as journalists. There will be certain reasons when, for example, where it's on an investigative story, when it may be justified in the public interest in not identifying ourselves. And of course, that's the reason why some serious documentaries exposing sort of wrongdoing have involved the use of sort of subterfuge of some kind, in the sense of perhaps undercover cameras and that sort of thing. And of course, we know from the consumer sort of programs like Rogue Traders and so on that is a technique that's acceptable in certain circumstances. Normally, though, as a common courtesy, it makes sense to tell somebody that if you are recording them or ask their permission in an interview. I think Nikra made a good point when she sort of said that part of the reason for actually recording something is to get your facts right. So certainly that can be a way of encouraging people not to be scared. I think certainly these days people are less likely to be worried about speaking into a tape recorder or whatever, but it's certainly true in broadcasting that part of the role of a TV interview would be to put people's minds at ease. I'm just picking up on Andriana's point as well. How do you know the rep's the appropriate person? I mean, obviously, many of the bodies that we've spoken, there is an official spokesman, and if you're going through the central sources for that organisation, you should be able to speak to, the appropriate source in terms of the press office. Nikra also made the point that, the press office is a double-edged tool, and, increasingly it's much more difficult these days than perhaps it was 20 years ago to access high-powered individuals from the sort of chief constable to, director of children's services or whatever, people who perhaps would have spoken to you directly 20 years ago are now much more used to dealing through a press office. And of course that's depends how strong the sort of press office set up and what the culture of secrecy is in the particular organisation you're dealing with. Steinway made a point about verifying the reliability of information from the internet, and I think you've all been in the situation, I'm sure, where you've looked up sources and have been given an inaccurate steer. I mean, possibly because you haven't used the right search tools, so that you've ended up with the organisation that's not the official one. So I think that's part and parcel of just getting used to the whole process of interviewing, researching, and so on. But I mean, obviously, researching through multiple, from multiple sources is likely to ensure that you are actually going to the right people. I'm just catching up with a couple of your questions now, so just apologies if I'm not able to answer just everything now that you've got into your mode. Nicola makes a good point about press offices. I mean, the criticism leveled by journalists of press officers is that some of them interpret that as being sub-press officers, and because many of them are themselves a former journalist, they are in a good position to suppress information as well. I mean, and although many of them express a criticism of journalists that journalists aren't sufficiently well briefed or knowledgeable about their subjects, that many press officers are in a position where they're duty bound to answer questions, but they're only duty bound to answer intelligent questions, the right questions, if you like. They don't have to volunteer information, especially if it's of a negative nature that would damage their organisation. So, although it may not be their sole aim in life to stand in your way, although it sometimes feels as if some of them are, many of them, I think, repeatedly sort of say to us, part of the problem is that journalists aren't asking intelligent enough questions. If they, and that's a question of us doing our research and of knowing what really we need to know when we go into an interview situation. I mean, clearly, if you're going on to a government press office, not really sure of what you're wanting to ask, then it's likely that it's going to be a fairly fuzzy and neutral and rewarding response that you get. And I think that's probably true of interviews too. It's essential that you have a clear idea, a sense of purpose to the interview, what you want to get out of it. And, Nicholas sort of says we need the chance to challenge bland statements. Well, that's exactly true, but I've been surprised, working on both sides of the fence, by how a point that you made earlier about journalists not being out of the office as much as they should, or being short-staffed, or being pressed for time, is that all too often that it's possible for an organisation to keep them hanging to the last moment and then suddenly give them a quote. And it is only human nature, perhaps, that a young journalist racing against deadline ends up sort of feeling grateful that they've got the quote in time, rather than really questioning whether the quote is of adequate quality and addresses the issues being raised in the question. And I think it's fair to say that some of the bullish tabloids, partly because of their confidence and partly because of their power in terms of readership, tend to be much better at this